What is xeriscaping? Well, it's a design technique that allows us to create a garden that requires very little or no irrigation. Traditionally, it was used to create desert-like gardens, areas where you have a lot of sand and gravel and rocks and a few cactus and really tough succulents put in. This type of garden requires very little or no watering whatsoever. Although the idea of no watering is a myth, and we'll have a look at that in a minute. If we expand the idea of xeriscaping and think of it more in terms of using less water, not necessarily zero water, then we can expand the type of gardens we have. A shade garden that's planted correctly and mulched correctly can require very little watering. My own shade garden hardly ever gets watered. In the last 2 or 3 years, it's received zero watering. Prior to that, it did get watered once or twice a summer if we had a really dry summer. But most years, it just coasts along. And provided you design it correctly and use the right kind of plants, these gardens don't really require a lot of irrigation, but can still look quite lush. They don't have to be filled with cactus. Xeriscaping is also not zero-scaping. Our traditional view of these kinds of gardens consist of a lot of bare areas, lots of sand and stones with not much growing there, maybe the odd green plant. But we can also create gardens that have a lot of flowers and look quite lush, provided we pick the right kind of plants. Iris, for example, are a very hardy plant, flowers really nicely, and hardly ever needs to be watered. Of course, the plant selection process does depend on your location and your natural water flow. Let's have a look at some myths about xeriscaping. Number one is that it's a technique that requires no water at all. And that's simply not true. Most plants will require a little bit of water. They can't go all year without it. But your rainfall may be enough to satisfy that need. Then we also have the situation of starting the garden. When we put new plants in the soil, even if they're cactus, they need to be watered for the first several years. So many of these gardens need to be watered initially, and they need to be watered anytime you make changes in them. Once a plant's established, if you pick the right one and you get enough rainfall, you may not have to water again. Another myth is that these gardens are made up of mostly rock, and that's simply not true. A lush garden can have all kinds of plants that cover the ground and have zero rocks or gravel. Now, it is important to pick the right plants. In my garden, I grow a number of large hostas, and they're pretty drought tolerant. In fact, it's one of the reasons we recommend them for dry shade, because they don't need a lot of moisture. On the other hand, I can also pick plants like my Rodgersia, which has thinner leaves, and it doesn't like to dry out. Its leaves will start to go brown and droop every time it runs out of some water. Another myth is that these gardens don't have a lot of color in them. They're mostly grays and grayish greens, but that's not necessarily true. A lot of desert plants bloom very nicely, and we have a lot of plants that are quite drought tolerant that bloom really nicely. I mentioned the iris earlier, and this is a fantastic plant that blooms early in the spring and then more or less goes dormant in the latter part of the season. It has large tubers and so requires very little watering, and those tubers are an indication that this plant can survive droughts. A lot of xeriscape gardens have very low plants. They hug the ground. That way they lose less moisture, and those kind of plants are good choices, but they don't have to be low growing. A garden can look quite nice. It can have a mixture of plants and hardscape. Those plants can have different colors and have some good height to them. We can even plant trees in a xeriscape garden. Another myth is that these gardens are no-maintenance type gardens. And although many of them require very little maintenance, it doesn't mean there's no maintenance. We still have to fertilize our plants, and if there's a real drought, we do have to water them. We have to mulch them. And as plants get old, they do need some care to keep them looking good. There's now a big push towards native plants. And I see this sentiment that if you select native plants, they don't need a lot of care. Because they're native, they're designed to grow there anyways. Now that idea is partially correct, but you still have to remember that you have to place the plant in the right spot. Around here, marsh marigolds grow all over the place, but they grow in ditches and along ponds where the soil is really wet. I can't take this native plant and bring it into my garden and put it into a dry, sunny spot. It just simply won't do well. So even though you use native, not all natives are going to do well in a particular spot. What about lawns? They get a real bad rap. We should get rid of our lawns because they need a lot of watering and they take a lot of fertilizer to grow them properly. Now that's not necessarily true. You can grow a lawn and never water it. And lawns really don't require a lot of fertilizer unless you want them really lush and green. So there's a couple things you can do. Consider reducing the size of your lawn. Replace it with some xeriscape gardens, and that will reduce the amount of water you need and reduce the amount of maintenance. One area that we all seem to want to have lawns is in the front yard, and I just don't see the purpose of those. In the backyard, we may have a lawn and use it. We have some picnic tables, we have kids playing on the lawn, we have dogs running around. That lawn is a perfect surface for that kind of activity. But we rarely do those kinds of activities in the front yard. So I think that's a perfect place to get rid of the lawn and replace it with a different type of garden. Another option is to look at different types of grasses. The cool grasses we grow do require a little more moisture if you want them to stay green. But you can also select grasses that like to get very dry. This includes the tall fescue and the buffalo grass. Now, they won't give you the same kind of manicured surface that our cool growing grasses will, but it will give you a lawn that requires a lot less irrigation. You can also replace part of the lawn with hardscape. The hardscape can now be used in the same way you use the lawn, to play on and have your kids active on this. Put some tables and benches there. That works really well. And then you can insert various gardens inside of that hardscape so you still have some greenery. Here's the solution I have for my lawn. I never water it. It hasn't been watered in 20 years. Our northern cool grasses are designed to go dormant in summer when it's dry. So as the water leaves the soil, the grass grows brown, but it doesn't die. Brown-looking grass is perfectly healthy, and it's just waiting for the next rainstorm and cooler weathers, and then it'll start to grow again and green up. So now I have a lawn that has very little maintenance, doesn't grow for several months of the year. I don't irrigate it, and I hardly ever fertilize it. What about your garden beds? What can you do there to reduce the amount of water you use? Well, the most important thing you can do is mulch your bed. My general philosophy is that I don't want to see soil anywhere. It should be covered with either plants or mulch all of the time. The mulch covers the soil. It keeps it cooler, which reduces evaporation. It also holds in moisture in the soil, so you don't have to water so often. I couldn't possibly garden without mulch on all my beds. A lot of people like annual bedding plants, and they're great. The problem with them is that they have very little root systems. They're not established plants because you just planted them a couple months ago. And so these kind of plants need to be watered all of the time. That's especially true if you do them in containers. So get rid of the annual bedding plants, or at least reduce the number. Plant selection can also be critical. Try to pick plants that have very succulent leaves. Thinner leaves lose water quicker than thick leaves. Think of the sedum. These are plants with very, very thick leaves, and they hardly ever need to be watered. So when you're selecting your plants, try to look for those kind of leaves. I've designed my gardens to be a mixture of pathways that have crushed rock in them, because that's very low maintenance, and distinct beds, and the beds are all mulched with wood chips. I also select plants that are fairly drought tolerant. So in my sunny garden, where I have sun all day long, again, I hardly water. I'm in zone 5 in southern Ontario, and I might water this garden once a summer, and that's it. We don't have heavy rainfall in this area, but by selecting the right plants and using mulch, they will survive. Now, not all the plants I put in survive. So the other thing I do is I let the plants establish themselves and see how they do. With my watering regime, some plants die out. They just can't take the dry soil. So slowly over time, I'm naturally selecting for plants that are hardier with less moisture. Don't baby your plant. There are also things you can do to your soil so that you have to water less. One of the best things you can do is to add a lot of organic matter, things like compost. Compost absorbs water and holds it nice and tight until plants can use it. So by increasing the amount of organic matter in your soil, you reduce the need for watering. A lot of gardeners with clay soil hate it, and they're always complaining, oh, the soil is so hard to dig in. But one thing to understand is that clay soil has a lot of nutrients, and it's great for holding on to moisture. In fact, that's one of the problems with clay. In colder climates in the spring, it just doesn't dry out fast enough. But by midsummer, we're all glad we have clay because it holds on to the moisture very tightly. Something that's not very popular in North America, but it is used quite a bit in Australia, is to add clay to a sandy soil. So they actually buy bags of clay and mix it in with their soil. That clay works like organic matter, except that it doesn't decompose as quickly, and it holds onto that moisture. It makes the soil much wetter and allows plants to grow with less irrigation. Now you can do the opposite too. If you have very heavy clay soil, you can add sand to that clay. Now there's a number of people who will tell you don't do that because you'll make hard concrete. Well, you clearly don't make concrete because that requires cement. But what they're trying to say is that the soil becomes harder and harder. And in some parts of North America, that may be the case. People in the Southwest seem to have this problem. On the other hand, people in the Northeast add sand to clay quite routinely, and it loosens the soil. The same technique is used in the UK and in Europe. Now, how do you know whether you have clay soil or sandy soil? Well, there are a couple techniques for measuring that. With practice, you can tell just by touching the soil. You get a handful of soil, make it moist, and rub it and squeeze it in your hand, and you'll be able to feel the sand. You'll be able to feel the clay because it's very smooth. But that technique does take some practice. A better technique for gardeners who don't do this all the time is to go out in the garden, get some soil, put it in a jar, add some water, shake it up, and then let it sit. After a minute, you put a line at the point where the soil has settled. Then you wait an hour and do it again. Then you wait 24 hours and do it again. You'll have 3 lines, and those lines indicate the amount of sand, silt, and clay that has settled. Now that is a very brief description, but I do have a whole video that will walk you through the steps and also show you how to do the calculations. I think this is something every gardener should do so that you understand what your soil is like. That tells you a lot about the nutrition in the soil as well as your watering needs. You can also reduce the amount of water your garden needs by changing your habits and doing things different in the garden. You can consider replacing sprinklers with drip irrigation. This works particularly well for vegetables. You can completely remove your automated irrigation system in your non-vegetable garden. As I said, once you get your plants used to less water, they will require less water. As long as you keep watering them a lot, they get used to that. And their root system stays near the surface of the soil because they never have any trouble getting water. As they get used to drier conditions, the root system goes deeper to access the water that's available. It's important to start watering less often, but deeper. You want that water a good 6 inches deep in the soil. How do you know it's getting there? Well, do your normal watering and then dig down in the soil and see if it's still moist at 6 inches deep. If not, you haven't watered enough. I generally water with sprinklers because I have a very large garden. But I run those sprinklers for 24 hours in a particular spot to make sure that the water goes good and deep. And then I leave it alone for a month or 2. Now, there are 2 general ways to water. One is with sprinklers, and the other is with some sort of a drip irrigation system. And I've seen a lot of comments saying, well, sprinklers are a real waste of water. Most of it evaporates as it's being sprinkled in the air. Those fine droplets all evaporate before it can hit the ground. Drip is much better because the water is very close to the soil, you get less evaporation, and it soaks right in where it drips. So I asked the question, well, what is the real difference between these two methods? How more efficient is drip irrigation? And the results surprised me. Drip irrigation is about 90% efficient, so about 10% of the water is lost during the drip irrigation process. While sprinklers are 75 to 85% efficient. So most of the water in a sprinkler system is still getting in the soil. It's still getting to where we need it. Now, drip irrigation is a little more efficient, but depending on your garden and your garden layout, it can be very inefficient to try and put a drip irrigation in. In my case, I've decided I can use a sprinkler system, cover a large area, but I only haul it out maybe once a year for a particular garden. So that's easier to do. At the back of my garden, I have this hill. And when I first moved in and started digging there to make a garden, I found that the soil there is very sandy. Whereas on the rest of my property, it's all fairly heavy clay. At first, I just thought the builders piled all the sand on the hill to get rid of it. But over the years, I've been working in the garden, and what I really have here is a sand vein. I have an area that's about 12 feet wide that runs through the property. And I can follow it up over the hill, down the other side, and right through my vegetable garden at the back of the property. So my hill is an extremely dry place. In some spots, it's almost pure sand. So what I did was I was very careful in selecting my plants here because I never want to water this hill. And even though it's a very dry location, I have flowers going most of the summer. In the late spring, I have all the rock garden plants, the rock phloxes flowering, and the whole hill is full of colors. So even though this is a very dry garden that never gets watered, it's very sandy soil, I still have a lot of flowering plants. The other garden I have is a full sun garden at the front of the property. That is clay soil, but it's in an area that I don't really want to water because I have to drag hoses to get to it. So again, I was very careful in selecting my plants. I use a lot of grasses because they just don't seem to need to be watered. Another thing you can do to help your soil is to keep the rain on your property. Unfortunately, many homes have been built to take away that water. The thinking there is that if we have a very heavy rain, we don't want it running into our homes. So we direct water away from the house. A lot of it gets directed to the front road where it's collected, put in the water collection system, and then the city takes care of it. That design is great to keep water away from your house, but it's not great for keeping the moisture in your soil. What we want to do is try and redirect that water flow to keep it on our property. And there's several things you can do. One of the biggest problems we have is that a lot of our driveways are a solid surface, so water can't run into the driveway, it just simply runs away. But you can replace the driveway with a semi-permeable material. Some people use smaller bricks, some people use larger stones. There's a lot of solutions. The trick is to make sure that there's spaces between the material so the water runs into the soil underneath the driveway. That prevents the water from running off your property. Now you might think, well, I don't grow anything on my driveway, so I don't really need it there. But you can actually grow low-growing grasses and other types of rock garden plants right in your driveway and let them grow in the cracks between the hardscape material. And even if you don't grow vegetation there, by having the moisture soak into the soil, it also soaks to the edge of the driveway and into the soil next to the driveway, and a lot of people grow plants there. Another great solution is to create swales between your property and the road. These are old ditches that we used to have, and we've kind of taken them out of our landscape. Well, put them back. And this can be as simple as a ditch, a depression in the soil. Or you can build a rain garden. And a rain garden is really nothing more than a low area where you put plants that can be wet for a short period of time. The idea of these ditches and rain gardens is that water doesn't sit there all the time. So after a heavy rain, it collects in the low spots. So we put plants there that can sit in water for a day or two. But after 2 days, that water should have soaked away into the soil, and the area is reasonably dry again. A few years ago, I made a YouTube video from a person in England who has an absolutely gorgeous backyard. They do everything in containers and hanging baskets, and everything is annual, so they're flowering all summer long. It's an absolutely fabulous garden. But first of all, it's in the UK that tends to get more rain naturally. And the person did admit he waters these almost every day. So it's the exact opposite of what we're trying to do here. But it is a really nice looking garden. We have a tendency these days to move towards containers, and they're becoming more and more popular all the time. And that's a problem because containers need to be watered a lot. So what you really want to do is get rid of all your containers. Grow in the ground. The water stays there much longer than in a container. But if you want to have a few containers, that's okay. Don't use these soilless mixes that dry very quick. I only have 1 or 2 containers, but those containers have 70% of my garden soil, which is reasonably heavy and have lots of clay. And then I throw in some compost to lighten it a bit. That grows great plants, but I only have to water once a week. A lot of gardeners now use raised beds for their vegetable garden. And although they work reasonably well, they look very nice, they're really terrible as far as irrigation goes. They dry out much faster than if those same plants were growing in the ground. And the higher you make those raised beds, the worse the problem is. So either eliminate raised beds or at least keep them short. They only have to be 6 inches off the ground. Here are some other tricks you can use to have a xeriscape type garden. Use more hardscape, different kinds of patio stones and bricks. If you use more hardscape, you'll also use less plants, which means you'll have to water less. Even in your gardens where the plants are growing, put in rocks, particularly larger rocks. They can be just as interesting as your plants. The other thing I suggest is adding artwork. I live on a 6-acre property, and about 1 acre of that is actual flower bed. But in that acre of gardens, I have some like 25 different pieces of art. Art never needs to be watered. In fact, it prefers not to be watered. So by including more artwork, you make the garden more interesting, and you have a very low maintenance feature. In my front garden, I decided to create a dry riverbed. Our soil is full of rocks, so every time I plant something, I get rocks. And what do you do with all those rocks? Well, I started making a riverbed. Throw the rocks in the riverbed. After a while, it looks like a nice solid river. Then I put a bridge over top to make it look a little more realistic. And then I planted around the riverbed. Now, the rocks are doing a couple things for me there. They're shading the soil underneath. They're trapping moisture underneath the rocks. So the plants growing next to the rocks are able to run their roots underneath the rocks and get extra moisture. So the garden needs to be watered less. And of course, the real bonus for me was I didn't have to haul rocks out of the garden. I even did the same thing on my hill garden. When we were sculpting the hill, I asked the excavator to bring back a few large rocks. So now I have these rocks that are 4, 5, 6 feet across, and I organized them to look natural, and then I filled all the spaces between them with the small rocks I dug out as I was planting things. So now I have a dry riverbed with a waterfall in the middle of it, and again, put a bridge over it to make it look a little more realistic. Now, to be honest, I have people visiting the garden, and I take them to the base of the hill, and I point up at my dry riverbed, and they look at me and say, well, where's the water? There is no water. This is a dry riverbed. Now, around here, dry riverbeds aren't that common, but in desert areas, you see them all over the place. You can also take this to an extreme. Think of the Japanese gardens that are made up of only rocks and sand. So you can have a large, beautiful rock in the middle of your garden. Maybe have 1 or 2 tiny, tiny little plants just to add some greenery. Surround it with crushed rock. You can rake the rocks just like the Japanese gardens, and you have an interesting garden that never has to be watered. Another trick to reduce watering is to group the plants by their watering needs. I talked about not using annuals, but a lot of people still like their annuals. So what you should do is put all the annuals in one area of the garden, one bed. That way you only have to water that one bed. Then take the plants that require less water and put them in a different bed. And then we can let that one be dry, and the area where the annuals are, we water a little more often. That's not a perfect xeriscape garden, but you are reducing the amount of water you have to add to your garden. Another trick is to select the right kind of plants. You want to find plants that have succulent leaves. They're typically harder, they're typically thicker. Or you want to find plants that have very small leaves. A lot of desert plants have these tiny little leaves, even the trees that grow there. The reason they do that is that smaller leaves have less surface area, which means less water evaporation. So look for plants with small leaves, things like lavender that have these skinny little long leaves. Also look for plants that have taproots or tubers. Plants that have a fibrous root system need to be watered more than those that have some sort of storage system underground to hold both nutrients and water. And look for bluish leaves. I'm not really sure why, but many of the drought-tolerant plants, like lavender, have bluish leaves. Bluish leaves tend to be more drought-tolerant. So here's some of my favorite examples. I love the yucca plant, and it's available as a green plant and as a variegated plant. It has a beautiful large flower head. The only thing I suggest is don't let this plant go to seed. It spreads fairly easily and creates a deep taproot that's really hard to get out once it's established. So I let it flower, I let it form seed heads, but before the seeds are ripe, I cut them off and get rid of them. Russian sage is perfect. Has nice coloration, has light bluish green leaves. Again, the leaves are very small. That indicates that this is a drought-tolerant plant. Flowers later in the year, giving you nice color all fall. There are many drought-tolerant grasses, and one of my favorite is the smaller Festuca glauca. It has these blue-green leaves that in zone 5 are hardy all winter long, so it's always green. As soon as the snow melts, I have green grass growing. And some trees are much more drought-tolerant than others. Around here, a native tree is the Kentucky coffee tree, and it has a nice large root system. It has smaller leaves, and it really doesn't need to be irrigated. In fact, once a tree is established, very few trees in the garden need to be irrigated, but some do better with more moisture. The Kentucky coffee tree can grow in quite dry, sandy conditions, and it still does well. So if you've selected the right plants, use less plants and more hardscape, prepare the soil so it holds moisture, you'll be able to reduce the amount of moisture you use dramatically. Now the garden can still look lush and green. Doesn't have to look like a desert. Think of xeriscaping as a range of gardening. At the one end, we've got a really dry desert where nothing grows. And at the other end, we have a lush garden that does need irrigation. Hopefully you have enough rainfall in your area so you don't have to irrigate. That's really the goal here. Try and create a garden that requires you to use the hose as little as possible. The garden around my house has over an acre of actual flower bed, and except for the vegetable garden, almost none of it gets watered all summer long. I have to have a drought of at least 4 weeks before I start watering anything, and that rarely happens in my Zone 5 garden. I hope you've enjoyed this program. If you want to find out the type of soil you have, look at this video right here. It walks you through the steps and calculates the final results. Once you know that, you'll be better able to select plants for your garden.